Welcome to the Real Estate Diaries, the weekly podcast exploring the real lives behind real estate, where ambition meets operations and success often comes with unseen pressure. Each episode, we dive into the human and operational realities faced by builders, property managers, and landlords, featuring candid insights and expert analysis on what it actually takes to build, operate, and scale property portfolios across Canada.
We document the lived experiences of property operators, the wins, the stress, the lessons, and the strategies shaping the future of real estate operations. Rather than selling products, the Real Estate Diaries tells the real stories of people building and managing properties, covering everything from coordination chaos and tenant management to growth bottlenecks, reputation risk, and the systems required to reclaim time and freedom.
The show is proudly sponsored by PropCare, a Canadian-built voice-first property operations platform that automates tenant, homeowner, and trade coordination, manages maintenance workflows, tracks costs, and delivers built-in Canadian compliance. So builders, landlords, and property managers can scale without adding staff or sacrificing their personal lives.
Today, we're tackling something that's fundamentally reshaping how property operators work across Canada: the massive regulatory transformation happening at federal, provincial, and municipal levels, with specific focus on what's coming in 2025 and 2026.
And we're basing this conversation on comprehensive research into policy developments that will affect every property operator in the country. The scale of change we're seeing isn't incremental policy adjustment. It's systematic restructuring of the regulatory environment governing 4.6 million Canadian renter households.
Let's establish the foundation. Canada's residential rental market serves approximately 30% of the population, generating over $240 billion in annual rental revenue. But what's crucial is understanding how regulatory complexity is creating fundamental shifts in market structure and competitive dynamics.
The industry operates across three distinct regulatory categories. Purpose-built rentals comprise approximately 1.8 million units nationwide, primarily governed by provincial residential tenancy acts. The secondary rental market represents the largest segment at roughly 2.8 million units, consisting of condominiums, houses, and small multifamily buildings.
Short-term rentals operate in rapidly evolving regulatory environments where municipal bylaws increasingly override provincial frameworks. Ontario represents the largest and most complex component of this market, with 1.6 million rental households, more than a third of the national total.
It also hosts the most intricate regulatory framework, centered around the Landlord and Tenant Board system, that currently processes approximately 85,000 applications annually. The LTB backlog situation has become a defining operational challenge for Ontario property operators.
Current hearing timelines average 8 to 12 months for standard applications, with even urgent applications averaging 4 to 6 weeks for initial scheduling. The tribunal operates with approximately 40 full-time adjudicators, serving a caseload that requires an estimated 60 to 70 members for timely resolution.
These delays create substantial financial impacts. A non-payment application that takes 10 months to resolve typically results in $4,200 in lost rental income before accounting for legal costs, which average $1,800 to $3,500 per case when engaging specialized tenancy counsel.
The financial burden extends beyond direct costs. Administrative overhead for compliance documentation consumes an estimated 2.5 to 4 hours weekly per 50-unit portfolio. Property damage during extended tenancy disputes averages $1,800 to $3,500 per unit where possession is delayed.
Insurance premium adjustments for regulatory risk range from 8 to 15% increases. These operational pressures are driving measurable market consolidation. Industry data shows that while large REITs and institutional operators expanded portfolios by 12 to 18% annually over the past 3 years, individual landlords with fewer than 10 units decreased holdings by approximately 8% during the same period.
This pattern reflects regulatory-driven consolidation, where compliance infrastructure requirements create scale advantages favoring institutional operators. Organizations with centralized compliance capabilities report 18 to 25% lower per unit compliance costs compared to property-by-property management approaches.
Canadian Apartment Properties, REIT, the country's largest residential landlord, has publicly attributed 15 to 20% of acquisition growth to smaller operators exiting due to regulatory burden. Their annual reports explicitly reference regulatory compliance infrastructure as competitive differentiation,
Now let's examine federal policy developments for 2025 and 2026. The National Housing Strategy Phase 2 renewal represents more than funding adjustments. It's a fundamental shift toward outcome-based accountability with enhanced federal oversight of housing policy implementation.
The federal government is implementing stricter criteria for NHS funding access, including measurable affordability targets, accelerated project approval timelines, and comprehensive reporting requirements. This transforms the federal role from passive funding partner to active strategic director in housing development.
Immigration policy changes create immediate demand-side impacts. Federal caps on international student visas and managed approaches to temporary foreign worker programs represent conscious population growth management. In urban centres and university towns, international students can represent 15 to 25% of rental demand.
The Federal Housing Accelerator Fund continues providing municipal incentives, but with increased federal oversight on local zoning and permitting modernization. Municipalities leveraging HAF funding commit to specific regulatory reforms that can benefit private development timelines.
Federal tax policy discussions include potential changes to capital gains inclusion rates for institutional investors and REIT taxation frameworks. While not finalised, these considerations could fundamentally alter cost of capital calculations and investment attractiveness for purpose-built rental development.
Provincial regulatory developments vary significantly across jurisdictions, creating complex compliance landscapes for multi-province operators. Ontario faces several potential policy shifts driven by political and affordability pressures.
Rent control policy review in Ontario has become increasingly likely, while full reintroduction to new construction remains unlikely due to supply concerns. Policy discussions include stricter above-guideline increase criteria, enhanced tenant renewal rights, and graduated control mechanisms affecting revenue predictability.
The Ontario government has announced LTB modernization initiatives, including adjudicator capacity expansion and procedural improvements. However, implementation effectiveness requires demonstration through actual backlog reduction and improved resolution timelines.
Municipal licensing standardization across the Greater Toronto Area represents provincial intervention to create consistency. However, implementation could either streamline compliance or introduce new baseline requirements across the region.
Property tax assessment methodology changes for rental properties in Ontario could significantly alter carrying costs. Any shift in how multi-residential properties are assessed, changes to vacancy allowances or income-based valuations, directly impacts operational expenses.
British Columbia continues aggressive measures against speculative housing through the speculation and vacancy tax framework. Further expansion of scope and potentially increased rates are expected, with evolving exemptions for specific rental supply types creating targeted investment opportunities.
Quebec's rent registry expansion represents enhanced government oversight, with potential influence on future rent adjustment calculations. The TAL tribunal system updates include enhanced enforcement capabilities and stricter documentation requirements that often preview national regulatory trends.
Alberta presents unique considerations with potential policy shifts. While traditionally averse to rent control, mounting public pressure on affordability could force policy reconsiderations, particularly following provincial elections.
Atlantic provinces face immigration-driven housing policy coordination challenges. Rapid population growth necessitates coordinated housing strategies, potentially creating land use liberalization, infrastructure investments, and direct incentives for purpose-built rental in growth areas.
Municipal policy evolution creates hyperlocal operational complexity. Toronto's enhanced short-term rental enforcement leverages technology to identify non-compliant operations, pushing supply toward long-term rental markets while creating compliance obligations for mixed-use portfolios.
Toronto's RentSafeTO program requires annual building evaluations for properties with 3 or more units, digital reporting through municipal portals with specific data formatting requirements, and progressive penalty structures ranging from $500 to $15,000 for non-compliance.
Vancouver's empty homes tax continues expanding scope and potentially rates, combined with tightening commercial to rental conversion policies. These create both compliance requirements and optimization opportunities for asset utilization efficiency.
Ottawa's multi-unit residential licensing creates additional compliance obligations, including property condition certifications from qualified inspectors, annual renewal processes with documentation requirements, and specific tenant communication protocols during emergency situations.
This episode of the Real Estate Diaries is brought to you by PropCare, because behind every real estate success story is a hidden operational load most people never see. PropCare was built to remove that load. It's a voice-first property operations platform that answers calls, coordinates trades, documents interactions, tracks expenses, and keeps builders, landlords, and property managers compliant without adding staff or complexity.
PropCare acts as a behind-the-scenes operations team, removing owners and managers from daily coordination while protecting reputation, improving service quality, and enabling portfolio growth without growing headcount. You can learn more about how PropCare works at propcare.ca.
Emerging municipal licensing trends in Calgary, Edmonton, and other mid-sized municipalities reflect success of existing programs in major cities. While not currently implemented, policy discussions provide early intelligence for proactive engagement with municipal planning processes.
ESG and sustainable housing mandates represent fundamental shifts from optional compliance to regulatory requirements. Carbon pricing mechanisms and energy efficiency targets create binding obligations for existing buildings, not just new construction.
Provincial building codes now mandate energy audits for buildings over 50 units every 5 years, disclosure of energy performance ratings to prospective tenants, minimum efficiency standards for heating systems and appliances, and integration with federal carbon pricing mechanisms affecting operational costs.
The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act creates ongoing compliance obligations, including barrier removal planning with specific timelines and budget allocations, alternative format communications for tenant documents, accessible website requirements for rental advertising, and staff training on disability accommodation protocols.
Social equity and affordable housing contributions increasingly demand specific contributions from developers and operators through inclusionary zoning mandates, required affordable housing units within market developments, and community benefit requirements.
Climate resilience and disaster preparedness drive new building code requirements and insurance premium adjustments. Investment in climate-resilient designs and infrastructure becomes competitive differentiation and long-term asset protection necessity.
Technology and privacy regulations represent emerging compliance requirements with substantial penalties for non-compliance. Bill C-27's expected passage enhances data privacy requirements, particularly affecting tenant screening processes using AI and predictive analytics.
The legislation requires stricter consent protocols for data collection, algorithmic transparency provisions, allowing applicants to understand screening decisions, and data retention limits with automatic deletion requirements. Penalties can reach 5% of global revenue.
Property operators using AI-powered screening tools must review current processes for compliance with new standards. This includes screening algorithms, data sources used in decision-making, and tenant information storage and access protocols.
Municipal smart city initiatives introduce potential building data reporting requirements while offering operational efficiency opportunities through integrated systems. Organizations participating in framework development can influence practical implementation approaches.
Cybersecurity requirements for rental housing data management extend beyond general data protection to industry-specific standards, protecting sensitive tenant information from breaches. Compliance costs are significantly lower than breach consequences.
Insurance markets have fundamentally altered regulatory risk assessment. Major insurers now require specific LTB dispute tracking, enhanced documentation protocols, and rental loss coverage exclusions, with premium increases of 12 to 18% for properties with dispute history.
Coverage gaps emerge in traditional landlord insurance for regulatory fines, compliance-related business interruption, costs associated with mandatory tenant relocations during environmental remediation, and legal defense costs for human rights claims.
Compliance cost analysis shows regulatory requirements now represent 15 to 25% of operational costs for professionally managed properties, compared to 8 to 12% in the early 2000s. This represents dramatic increases in compliance burden over relatively short timeframes.
Direct costs include LTB application fees at $190 per application, legal counsel engagement at $350 to $500 per hour for tenancy specialists, mandatory training and certification at $1,200 to $2,800, annually per property management staff member, and specialised compliance software licensing.
Indirect costs include lost rental income during LTB proceedings averaging $2,100 to $4,200 per month for disputed units multiplied by 8 to 12-month resolution timelines, administrative overhead for compliance documentation, property damage during extended tenancy disputes, and insurance premium adjustments.
Technology infrastructure costs have evolved from optional to essential. Integrated property management platforms with compliance tracking range from $25 to $45 per unit annually. Digital documentation and audit trail systems cost $8 to $12 per unit annually.
Tenant screening platforms with privacy compliance range from $15 to $25 per application processed. Technology implementation timelines require realistic expectations. Basic compliance tracking platforms start around $20 per unit annually, while comprehensive systems range from $60 to $120 per unit annually.
Implementation typically requires 6 to 12 months for full deployment, significantly longer than vendor-quoted 60 to 90-day timelines, due to integration challenges with existing systems, staff training requirements, and data migration complexity.
Organizations achieving best-in-class compliance efficiency report 18 to 25% lower regulatory costs per unit compared to property-by-property management approaches through centralized compliance operations and integrated technology stacks.
Risk assessment for 2025 to 2026 includes multiple provincial and federal elections, creating policy platform divergence on housing. Potential government changes could drastically alter tax incentives for purpose-built rental, mandate aggressive social housing contributions, or implement unexpected regulatory frameworks.
Economic pressure impacts regulatory priorities unpredictably. High inflation, interest rate volatility, or economic downturns can shift governments toward populist policies like expanded rent control, or conversely toward supply-stimulating deregulation depending on perceived economic urgency and public pressure.
Public sentiment on affordability, tenant rights, and developer responsibility directly influences policymaker decisions. Systematic community engagement and public relations can help shape balanced policy environments rather than simply reacting to policy outcomes.
Interest rate environment influences government housing strategy through affordability pressure mechanisms. Sustained high rates exacerbate affordability issues, increasing political pressure for intervention. Conversely, falling rates might reduce perceived urgency, allowing less aggressive policy interventions.
Strategic action frameworks require immediate implementation across multiple operational areas. Regulatory intelligence infrastructure across federal, provincial, and municipal jurisdictions has become essential rather than optional for professional operators.
Comprehensive financial modeling testing various regulatory change scenarios enables proactive positioning rather than reactive responses. Organizations with robust scenario planning report 50 to 70% faster adaptation to regulatory changes.
Technology compliance audits should focus immediately on tenant data handling and AI screening processes to prepare for Bill C-27 requirements. Non-compliance carries both substantial financial penalties and reputational risks affecting financing access and operational licensing.
Enhanced documentation systems exceeding minimum legal requirements provide protection during LTB proceedings and insurance claims. Organizations implementing superior documentation protocols report 40 to 55% better outcomes in contested applications.
Geographic diversification across provinces with different regulatory environments provides operational stability while mitigating concentrated regulatory risk. Portfolio strategies balancing market opportunity with regulatory complexity optimize long-term performance.
Advocacy engagement through industry associations and government consultation processes allows operators to influence policy development phases rather than simply responding to external changes. Organizations participating in policy development shape implementation approaches and transition timelines.
Proactive regulatory engagement includes maintaining relationships with industry associations like the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario and Canadian Federation of Apartment Associations, participating in government consultations with data-driven input, and engaging municipal housing policy staff during bylaw development phases.
Centralized compliance operations serving multiple properties reduce per-unit costs through specialization and automation. Organizations deploying centralized compliance teams with specific functional expertise achieve 25 to 35% better outcomes than generalist approaches.
Standardized multi-jurisdictional protocols enable efficient management across provincial boundaries. Organisations with properties in multiple provinces report 30 to 40% lower per unit compliance costs when deploying centralised protocols compared to jurisdiction-specific management.
The fundamental strategic insight from this analysis is that regulatory complexity has evolved from compliance obligation to competitive differentiator. Organizations mastering regulatory frameworks gain sustainable advantages, while those treating regulation as external burden face increasing operational challenges.
Success in the current environment requires three core capabilities that we've seen consistently across successful operators: robust compliance infrastructure, navigating multi-jurisdictional complexity, integrated technology platforms automating documentation and risk management, and proactive regulatory engagement positioning operators to influence rather than merely react to policy evolution.
For property operators at any scale, the strategic imperative is clear. Regulatory mastery must become a core business competency alongside financial analysis, market knowledge, and operational efficiency. This isn't an administrative function, it's strategic capability determining competitive positioning.
The transformation toward regulatory complexity is still in early stages, providing competitive positioning opportunities for organizations investing in regulatory capabilities now. The scale advantages in compliance infrastructure create barriers to entry favoring organizations with specialized expertise.
Organizations that master regulatory complexity while identifying embedded opportunities will emerge stronger from this transformation. Those viewing policy changes as obstacles will struggle with increasing competitive disadvantage as regulatory sophistication becomes industry standard.
The choice facing every operator is whether to view regulatory complexity as threat to minimize or capability to master. That choice determines not just operational survival, but competitive positioning for the next decade of industry evolution.
The regulatory environment will continue evolving with additional complexity, likely rather than simplification. Political pressures, economic conditions, and social priorities will drive continued policy development affecting property operations across all jurisdictions.
Organizations building regulatory intelligence, compliance excellence, and advocacy engagement into operational foundations will find themselves with sustainable competitive advantages in an industry where regulatory sophistication increasingly differentiates successful operators from struggling ones.
Implementation requires immediate action across multiple priorities. Establish regulatory monitoring capabilities, implement enhanced documentation systems, review insurance coverage for regulatory risks, and develop relationships with specialized legal counsel and industry associations.
Medium-term positioning involves technology implementation for compliance management, cooperative arrangements for accessing specialized expertise, and scenario planning processes modeling financial impacts of potential policy changes and response protocols.
Long-term strategic positioning requires developing thought leadership in regulatory compliance, building proprietary solutions or processes creating competitive advantages, and establishing advocacy capabilities influencing policy development rather than simply adapting to external changes.
The regulatory landscape will reward organizations that invest in understanding, mastering, and optimizing within complex frameworks, while penalizing those that remain reactive to external policy developments.
For our listeners managing properties across Canada, the message is unambiguous. Begin building regulatory capabilities immediately. The competitive advantages available to early movers in regulatory mastery will not remain available indefinitely as industry standards evolve.
Whether managing 10 units or 10,000, regulatory expertise has become as critical as financial analysis and market knowledge for long-term success in Canadian property operations.
Next week on the Real Estate Diaries, we'll explore specific implementation strategies for building compliance technology, infrastructure, and documentation systems that provide operational protection while improving efficiency.
Until then, remember that this regulatory transformation creates opportunities alongside challenges for operators willing to master complexity rather than simply endure it.
The Real Estate Diaries is sponsored by PropCare, the voice-first property operations platform built in Canada to automate coordination, compliance, and maintenance for builders, landlords, and property managers. PropCare answers every resident and homeowner call 24/7 under your brand, coordinates verified trades, documents every interaction, tracks expenses automatically, and delivers built-in Canadian compliance including warranty and provincial requirements.
PropCare functions as a behind-the-scenes operations team, removing owners and managers from daily coordination while protecting reputation, improving service quality, and enabling portfolio growth without growing headcount. If you want your properties to work for you instead of the other way around, visit propcare.ca. New episodes of the Real Estate Diaries drop every Sunday, documenting the real operational experiences driving success in Canadian property markets.